I'm here on earth for a reason. I'm here on earth to do something. Now, what is it? Once you figure that out, life becomes a lot easier. Attack the day or it will attack you. I get up at 4:15 every morning. I go work out. I come get breakfast, and then I get in the office. And to me, I want to have the jump on the day before it jumps on me.
My guest today is country music author and historian and a member of the Western Music Hall of Fame, Don Cusic. Don is the author of over 30 books, including biographies of Roger Miller, Eddy Arnold, Gene Autry, and Chet Atkins. He's also written album liner notes for Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson, George Jones, Ray Stevens, Eddy Arnold, Sonny James, as well as for multiple film soundtracks. Don has a number of credits as a producer and songwriter, and is a professor of music industry history and a professor of music business at Belmont University. During the interview, we spoke about the evolution of the Nashville music scene, Chet Atkins, the man behind the Nashville sound, Don's writing journey, the changing landscape of Music Row, and much more. I spoke with Don from his office in Nashville. All right, Don, I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you. You have a big, long history in Nashville, and I want to know all about it. But first of all, you wrote a book about, was it Nashville Sound?
Yes.
Illustrated timeline?
Yes.
Okay. I want to know about how Nashville has changed musically. And the way I understand it wasn't always a, Music City, USA.
In 1945, at the end of World War II, Nashville did not have a single record label or recording studio in town. 15 years later, 1960, we're known all over the world as Music City, USA. The shift on music, because really, it starts with the Fifth Jubilee Singers. And so here you've got black gospel, and then, of course, you're going to have white gospel. You've got the big band era. A lot of the country producers, or at least Owen Bradley, came out of the big band era. There was a key factor in that Ernest Tubb, we finally get a record label, Bullet Records, and a guy named Jim Boulay, which it looks like it should be Bullet, except for, unless you're French. He started a record label, Bullet Records, and they had a #1 pop hit called Near You, and it sold a gazillion records. And Owen Bradley asked Ernest Tubb, and Ernest Tubb was a big record seller, big star, if he would like to record in Nashville, because he'd been recording in New York and Cincinnati and LA. And he said, yeah. And Owen Bradley always said that if Ernest had said no, there would have been no recording center in Nashville. It was that powerful, because once Ernest did, then it's easy for everybody to follow. And they have that studio here.
The Nashville sound continues to evolve. It's way different now than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah. And a lot of that's technology. Now, in terms of, that when you talk about the Nashville sound, you're really talking about several things. One is that it came out of rock and roll. They wanted a smoother sound. The Jim Reeves, the Eddy Arnolds, they got rid of the fiddle and put in the violins. They got rid of the steel guitar and put in a piano. If you played Patsy Cline's Crazy, that's that new Nashville sound. With Patsy Cline, you don't hear a steel guitar. You don't hear a fiddle. You hear strings, you hear a piano, that sound. And then if you move it further, if you ever listen to Eddy Arnold's song, Make the World Go Away, which he's got a big orchestra and stuff. And that, sound-wise, that's a Nashville sound. The other thing the Nashville sound is the musicians playing with head arrangements. And there's only 5 or 6 of them, where in LA and New York, you had 20 musicians. And, the singer said, it's in C. Let's drop it to B flat. Well, you have to go, you get all these arrangers to write charts. In Nashville, they may say, well, let me use my capo, but they probably say, okay, how's that? Oh, now do you want to move it down to A? They could do that off the top of their head. Those are several things that are the Nashville sound. Another reason it's the Nashville sound is it's profitable. That story about, Chet Atkins said it was a German who came in and said, do you know what the Nashville sound is? And Chet Atkins says, no. And he jingles some coins in his pocket. And he said, that's the Nashville sound. Nashville was based on cutting singles for jukeboxes. It was not an album. We don't have a country album chart until 1964. Wow. Everybody else was doing albums. And of course, you'd have an Eddy Arnold, a Johnny Cash, a Chet Atkins doing some albums, but by and large, it wasn't an album market.
You just mentioned Chet Atkins, and you wrote a book about him.
Yes.
What's that about?
Well, Chet Atkins was not only a great guitar player, revolutionary guitar player. He developed a style that nobody else had. He was also a producer, produced a bunch of hits. He was also a RCA executive. So you can't have a Chet Atkins today like you did back then. He's one of those people that guided Nashville, one of the key figures making Nashville a transition into Music City, USA. And so, his guitar playing alone as an artist is phenomenal. He does a lot of jazz. He's a country boy, but he plays a lot of jazz.
When I was growing up, I knew him strictly as a guitar player. Mm-hmm. And I was surprised then when I'd look and I'd see his name as a producer. And then later on to find that he a high-powered record executive as well. So I could see why a book would be really interesting about him because he had so many interesting facets to him.
I had to cut a lot out. I sent it to the publisher and he says, hey, this is too big. You got to cut some stuff down. And I did, but hopefully it kept the key stuff in there. Yeah, because, for a writer, every time you have to cut, it's like you bleed. And
yes,
but there's never been a biography of Chet Atkins. It's amazing.
I'm shocked.
Yeah, he had written an autobiography back in the 70s, and he had put together a book on me and my guitars, where all the guitar freaks are going to buy that. It's kind of a coffee table book, but there's never been a biography of him.
Wow. Okay, well, let's talk about your writing because you've written so many books. I get the feeling that you write very much the way I do, where I write from a historical perspective. It's like I want to make sure these techniques are preserved before they kind of go out into the ether. I don't know for sure, but I think that your approach is somewhat similar.
Yeah.
You're a historian first.
You have to put the person in historical perspective because, of course, the images were individualist, the John Wayne, I did it all myself. But really, it's a confluence of things coming in that Chet Atkins was in the right place at the right time. We couldn't have a Chet Atkins today. We needed one then. He wasn't the only one. There was a guy named Owen Bradley, who also was a big-time producer, produced the Patsy Cline record. And so it makes it more interesting, too, because you say, what else is going on around here? These guys don't live in isolation. And so, trying to dig that out. So that's the fun of the writing.
You grew up in Maryland, and I'm curious how a Maryland boy could be so influenced by country music. How did that happen?
Well, Maryland's kind of a divided state, and I always thought of myself as a Southerner. But it goes back to a little plastic radio that sat on top of the refrigerator. First thing in the morning, they'd play country music, and then over dinner time, they'd play country music, and then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they'd play rock and roll because that's when the kids got off. And at 10 o'clock in the morning, they played this Montevani strings. Stuff, there's a variety of things. So, my three major music influences are Hank Williams, Roger Miller, and the Beatles. And, I grew up in the time of the Beatles when, and the stuff you're hearing today was a new release, And so I love the Beatles. I was watching Ed Sullivan when they made that first appearance. Also love Roger Miller, who was hitting at the same time the Beatles were. And Hank Williams. There was a Hank Williams movie that came out at that time in around 64 or so. And I learned later it was a lot of non-facts, alternative facts. But I watched it and I loved it. And my uncle loved country music and Hank Williams. So those influences all come together. The other thing, I'm from Southern Maryland, a place called Leonardtown in St. Mary's County. It's where the Patuxent and Potomac come together. And so I always thought of myself as a Southerner. And, you get to Tennessee and you ain't no Southerner. They'd always say, you come from New England. I said, no, it's not New England. And you say, it's below the Mason-Dixon line. They go, yes, it is. And they didn't know where the Mason-Dixon line was. But I was in a little country band for a while. And, when I was at school and in college. And we were different. We, young guys playing country music because that was old people's music. And of course, all these other guys our age, they were playing rock and roll. So they got the girls. We got the girls' grandmothers. So anyway, how do you explain your taste? That's kind of hard to explain why you like something.
Okay, so when you got to Nashville then, what made you move to Nashville?
I'd always wanted to live in Nashville. As soon as I graduated from college, I built a bed in the back of a van and moved down. Spent the first night in Knoxville, maybe the first 2 nights in Knoxville, then came into Cookeville, which is about halfway between Knoxville and Nashville, and then moved to Nashville, and that was in 73. And I lived in my van for a while, for about 6 months, and finally found some friends and who put me up. But I just always wanted to be in Nashville. That was my calling.
Okay, so here's a Nashville sociology question, I guess you'd call it. So I have friends that have moved to Nashville from Los Angeles, and they back within a year or two. These are very accomplished people. And they would tell me that they had a real hard time integrating, where people would appreciate what they did, but they wouldn't necessarily bring them in, to give them work or even be friends, except on a very shallow level. So did you notice that when you moved there?
Not really. Now, of course, I had long hair. I had hair, and I had long hair at the time. And so you were a hippie at that period of time. And they kept you at a distance. But, once I got to know them, no problem. There's 3 places in this country that are different than anywhere else. And that's New York City, Texas, and Southern California. And the Southern California guys, there's a story about this guy, he shows up at the recording session. It's in August, all this heat, and he's wearing leather. And they're going, only an LA guy would wear leather. So the LA guys stereotype us, we're kind of a little behind things and a little bit redneck and, inside game. And we stereotype them, they obsessed with being cool, that kind of thing. So it's a different culture. It really is. Some can adapt and some can't. I don't know how else to say that.
Yeah, I don't know about the leather jacket, but I think people expect you to be cool in one way or another.
Oh, yeah.
That's just part of the environment. That's a little less so now than it used to be. But boy, during the 80s and 90s especially, there was a lot of pressure on you to be as cool as you could be.
And country never was cool. Until recent.
Well, it is now. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so you get to Nashville and you didn't want to be a player, or you tried to be a player or a songwriter first? Is that what happened?
I wanted to be a songwriter. I called myself a musician until I got to Nashville. And even today, if we're in Iowa and you say, do you play the guitar? I'll say, yeah. If we're in Nashville and you say, do you play the guitar? I go, not really. The level of talent is so great here. Of course, I haven't picked up a guitar hardly at all, these last few years. But that's the thing, that level of talent is just incredible. And, you talk to people who visit Nashville and they go to a club and see a band or a singer-songwriter, and it's so much more professional than it was at home. So that's it's a magnet. It's a magnet for musicians.
The only other place I've ever seen like that was Cuba, where the average street musician was, I don't want to say the level of an A-list player, studio player, but not that far away. It's funny because a lot of times you have a female singer and you say, well, give her a tambourine. And she just, sort of gets it on the beat and sometimes not. And in Cuba, tambourine is a very serious instrument. Yeah. And if you're going to play tambourine, you better have some, pretty good rhythm chops. So I was shocked. Again, you're right. In Nashville, it's very much like that. But Cuba, like even street musicians, were just outstanding. It was amazing.
You can find it in New Orleans a bit too. Some of those horn players.
Yeah.
Cuba was just locked away. I guess they didn't have anything to do with practice for years, because we had an embargo going there.
Yeah, that's for sure. I wish they'd open it again, to be honest with you, but that's another story. So how did you get into writing books?
Well, my degree's in journalism. I started out working for newspapers. Then I went with magazines and then got with a trade magazine. It just kind of evolved. As Robert Frost said, as way leads on to way, that path, the two paths. There was kind of I'd always wanted to write books, sort of, then abstractly the idea. And it just evolved into it was a book that needed to be written. And so that's kind of how it evolved. I don't, other than saying I like the idea of writing books to start with, and then the opportunities were there, and you just kind of followed them. And I had access to a lot of people because of working for a trade magazine. Trade magazine was very important because it was the link between the record label and radio and the retailers. So that, gave me access to whoever I wanted to get to.
I had exactly the same experience where I was writing for trade magazines, multiple ones as a freelancer. And there was a book that needed to be written.
What'd you write?
The Mixing Engineer's Handbook.
Oh, okay.
And there was no book on mixing at the time. And everybody said, you can't write that because it's too subjective. And I thought, well, I'll give it a try. Mostly because my mixing was not good and I wanted to learn something. And I knew all the best people in the world because I wrote for trade magazines.
Yeah.
So I went and I asked them how they did it, and they told me, and I wrote the book.
Well, I bet, Belmont, where I am, has a bunch of mixing engineers
Yes.
and engineers, audio engineering technology is a major here.
They use my book, and I've spoken there a few times as well. So, yeah, I love Belmont. The quality of student is excellent there.
Yeah. And I used to teach at a public university in Middle Tennessee State. And of course, they were not as demanding of students to get in. You didn't have to get as high a score. And it's all a difference in the world. It really is, those two worlds.
Tell me about writing liner notes for albums. How do you approach that?
A lot of that came from people who were the heads of labels or connected to labels. And they wanted some liner notes written, or I would approach them. When I did the Dolly Parton liner notes, I had this idea. It's like I'd spent a lot of nights alone with Dolly Parton, but it evolved into, I was sitting and listening to her records. I thought it was a nice hook, and I sent it to Joe Galani, who was with RCA, and he sent it to Porter Wagner, and Porter Wagner pretty much gave the okay, and he sent it to Dolly, and she liked it okay. So that was that. Kind of the same thing happened on the Willie Nelson liner notes, and again, Joe Galani at RCA. The Curb stuff I've done is from knowing Mike Curb. And like he put together that 60th anniversary of Sun Records, and he said, need you to write some liner notes on this. And so that's kind of how those things happen.
Okay, here's a good question for you. So the evolution of music is way different in Memphis than it is in Nashville. And the sound is way different, but they're not all that far apart geographically. Why is that, do you think? Well,
obviously the Black influence is a lot more prevalent in R&B than it is in country. But the thing of it is that Nashville had a business substructure that allowed it to have record labels and music businesses. And Memphis didn't. I mean, Memphis couldn't organize a barbecue. It was just, it didn't have that business, that infrastructure in there. Same thing with Austin, Texas. Same thing happened. They had all the talent, but they hated business. It wasn't cool to like business. And Nashville did, basically coming out of the WSM and the Grand Ole Opry and the life insurance company and all that. The Black influence was real deep in Memphis. It's actually in Mississippi. It's not really in Tennessee. And Nashville didn't. Nashville was the music of the white working class. Now that's changed a bit. There's more African Americans in now, but they tended to get the R&B blues influence off of records rather than live in the clubs. And so I think that's where Memphis really had the advantage in terms of R&B, is they had that Black influence.
It makes sense when I think about it. Yeah, you're right. Okay, and let's talk about Music Row for a second. So I don't go to Nashville often, but every time I go there, I'm amazed at there's a little less of Music Row than there used to be. Does it really exist anymore?
Yes, it does. And a lot of that is thanks to Mike Curb, who, owned Curb Records. And he was in a position to invest in Music Row and preserve these buildings. Music Row is caught in the middle between the Gulch, which has been developed, which is the old train area, and Vanderbilt and Belmont. And so developers love this. I mean, here you go. And they have wiped out whole blocks in order to build, condos and restaurants and all that sort of thing. So, yes, it exists. It exists as a physical space because the buildings have been preserved. In terms of the idea of Music Row being the creativity of country, it exists, but it doesn't exist in those buildings. Because, as country has grown, the country as well as country music has grown, they needed bigger buildings and that were wired. I mean, those old houses didn't have internet connections, and so consequently they had to move out, and then it got expensive, and so when it gets expensive, you drive people away a bit. So yes, spiritually it exists. It still exists. I think that mentality, that Tin Pan South, Tin Pan Alley, that exists and exists as far as buildings are concerned.
It's a real shame. It was so unique. There was old houses that you'd go into and it was a label or a publishing company it's so unique. I wish it was still like that. But as you say, it probably can't be. Well,
it's a lot more corporate now too. Because it used to be the major labels dominated everything. They sold 80 to 90% of the records. And now we've got independent labels, and now we've got the artist as label. The guy who plays a gig, records it, puts it up on Spotify or YouTube. And so you have that whole shift in the functions of what Music Row does, which was the business center. And business, again, got more corporate. And of course, the major labels were corporate.
I'm curious about the digital mentality of Nashville. What I mean by that is, for the longest time, and I think country music was the biggest holdout on this, where you wanted to be in front of people, and that's the way you grew your audience prior to when we all turned digital, and now it's done so much online. And I know a lot of the big country acts are there, and they're doing that. But how about everybody else? Is there an embrace of the digital lifestyle, I'm talking more for music creators?
Yeah, because you can sit in your basement or your bedroom or your dorm room, and the technology itself with Pro Tools, which is software program on a laptop, and you can cut an album. And because it's digital, the sound quality is as good as a studio. It used to be you had to be in a studio. You don't have to do that now. There's certain advantages of a studio. But yes, they embrace that because that used to be a gatekeeper, the technology. Because you had to pay $150 an hour or whatever it was to get into the studio. You had to hire 5 musicians. Now you can get 1 or 2 buddies, or maybe some can do all the instruments themselves. And so they like that idea of no gatekeeper. And I have students come to me and go, "Oh, last night I wrote a great song and it's up on Spotify, or we did a video and it's on YouTube. You ought to check it out." So they like that. They like that access.
Yeah, there's no gatekeeper, but there's no marketing either. So who's going to listen to it?
Well, that's the thing, and I ask them, I say, "Now, what's your marketing plan?" We're going to let it go viral. Well, let it go viral is not a marketing plan. A lot of that stuff just goes into a bottomless pit. And if you go through and look at some of that stuff, they get 100 views. That's friends and neighbors. It's a big deal if they've got 1,000 views. That means they've watched a lot. But the marketing is not there. Well, I take that back. The marketing is there, but it's going to cost you money. Yeah. And the students don't want to play any money. Internet equals free a lot of times. So
the funny thing is I live very close, within walking distance, to 2 of the major mastering houses in Los Angeles. And they're my friends. So sometimes I'll just walk up and hang out. And always, every single time, someone will play something and say, "Listen to this. It sounds so great." I say, well, cool. What are they going to do with it? Well, they don't know. So they make these great records and have no marketing in mind, and no release strategy. So it goes from, the student in the dorm room all the way through pros that are doing this independently, and they forget about that really critical piece, which, that's what a label gives you, really.
Yeah. Well, of course, they've got company. Well, I don't know if you've heard of 30 Tigers, but it's a company that you can get the services of a record company. I know there's bound to be some out in LA. You need publicity. Right. Okay, we got this. If you need radio promotion, we got that. If, on down the line, just check off the list. You have to pay for it. But these guys they don't have the money, and so
Yeah.
you're figuring at least 30,000 to be fully marketed over about a 2-year period. So they don't do that.
That's the boundary to entry.
Yeah. There's always a gatekeeper.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. What don't people know about you that you wish they would?
Goodness, I don't know.
Or about what you do?
Basically, I'm a writer. Writing is not something you do. Writing is who you are. And so that's the essence of me. I'm a writer. I write even when there's no publisher around. I write even when there's no outlet or an outlet set up. I'm hoping for an outlet somewhere along the line. But I wrote a book. Do you remember a guy named Junior Gilliam with the Dodgers?
Yes, sure. Yeah.
I wrote a novel based on his life. And I have no idea how to get that thing published or who would buy it or anything. But it just was... I needed to do it. And in a couple of months, I got it done. So that's the essence of me right there.
What's the best piece of advice you learned along the way or somebody imparted to you?
Persistence, because you don't always get encouragement. But, I remember my freshman English teacher in college, he said, you can't write. You should join the Army. It's okay. I didn't believe him. I thought I could write. But looking back, he had a point. Yeah, I think that persistence and a purpose, and you hear that, what is your purpose in life? And that really gives you a reason to get up in the morning. That I'm here on earth for a reason. I'm here on earth to do something. Now, what is it? And once you figure that out, life becomes a lot easier. And the other thing I always say, attack the day or it will attack you. I get up at 4:15 every morning. I go work out. I come get breakfast. And then I get in the office. And to me, I want to have the jump on the day before it jumps on me. So that's kind of part of a lifestyle thing. But that's another advice.
Thanks for listening and being in my inner circle. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@bobbyowsinski.com. You can also learn all about the latest in music, audio, and production news, and find out about openings for my latest online classes at bobbyowsinski.com. This is Bobby Owsinski. I'll see you next time.